He signed the papers at 11:47 p.m. Adrian Veilhart sat at the head of a 14-foot mahogany table, the same table where he had closed nine-figure deals, shaken hands with senators, and poured expensive whiskey for men who feared him. And he signed his name on the divorce papers like he was canceling a subscription. No hesitation, no pause. He didn't even uncross his legs. Alara Voss had cooked his meals for 10 years. She had sat in the back of boardrooms she was never introduced in. She had ironed his shirts before 5 a.m. and learned to stop crying quietly enough that he wouldn't hear. And the man who once told her she was the only thing that made sense to him signed her out of his life in under 4 seconds and reached for his scotch before the ink was dry. "Have the documents couriered to her attorney by morning," he said to no one in particular. Then the lights went out across the entire estate. Not a flicker. Not a surge. Everything, the chandelier, the security panels, the perimeter floodlights, killed simultaneously, cleanly, as if someone had simply decided that Adrian Veilhart's world should go dark. He was still holding his glass when the sound began. Low, steady, rhythmic. The unmistakable percussion of rotor blades over water. Then headlights. Not from the driveway, but from the private airfield he had built behind the estate for his own convenience, now burning with activity he had not authorized. His head of security, Marcus Holt, burst through the side door with a flashlight and a face that had lost its color entirely. "Sir?" Marcus's voice was wrong, stripped of its usual precision. "You need to see this. If you've ever given everything you had to someone who never looked up long enough to notice, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end, because what Alara Voss does next will change the way you see quiet people forever. If this is your kind of story, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's begin. The airfield was supposed to be empty. Adrian had no scheduled flights. His pilot was in the Maldives. The hangar crew had been dismissed 2 days ago when he'd flown back from Geneva with Victor Halden and hadn't wanted witnesses to the conversation they'd had on the tarmac. What waited on that airfield now was not his crew. A black Gulfstream G700 sat at the far end of the runway with its engines still running, heat shimmering off the fuselage in the cold November rain. Flanking it on both sides were 6 black Escalades, parked in a disciplined arc. The men standing outside them were still, completely, unnervingly still. 20 or more of them, each in a charcoal suit, no ties, earpieces in, hands folded in front of them like men who had been trained to wait without moving. Not bodyguards. Not contractors. Something older than that. Adrian stood at the edge of the runway with Marcus at his shoulder, the rain hitting the back of his neck, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt small. The door of the jet lowered. One man came down the steps. He was tall, not in an ostentatious way, but in the way of a man whose height was simply the least interesting thing about him. Late 40s. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that had clearly been on the wrong end of something at some point in his life. A thin scar ran from below his left ear to the corner of his mouth, faded but permanent. He wore a black overcoat that cost more than some people's cars, and he walked across the wet tarmac without looking at the rain. He stopped 10 feet from Adrian. He looked at him the way a man looks at something he has already calculated and found insufficient. "Adrian Veilhart," he said. His voice was low. American, but layered over something. European schooling, maybe, or years spent in rooms where every word had weight. "My name is Cassian Rourke." The name meant nothing to Adrian in that moment. It would mean everything by morning. "You threw away the woman who saved your life." Cassian said it without heat, without performance, the way you state a fact to someone who's been avoiding it. "We came to bring back the daughter of the empire you never knew existed." Adrian's first instinct, and this is a thing about Adrian Veilhart that mattered, that would matter more as the night went on, was to be offended. "I don't know who you think you are," Adrian started, "but this is private property, and whatever you're—" "She signed the papers," Cassian said. "Didn't she?" It wasn't a question. Adrian stopped. "She signed them 2 hours ago, in the office of her attorney. Didn't cry. Didn't make a scene." Cassian tilted his head slightly. "I know because I had someone there. Not to intervene, just to make sure she was safe." His eyes held Adrian's without effort. "She's been under our protection for the last 6 years, Mr. Veilhart. You simply didn't know it. The rain was getting heavier. Marcus had not moved. The men by the escalades had not moved. I think, Adrian said carefully, that you need to tell me exactly who you are. I told you who I am. You told me a name. Cassian looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, the kind that meant he had expected this conversation and found it exactly as tedious as anticipated. Come inside, Cassian said. There's a great deal you need to understand. And most of it, he added, turning back toward the jet, is going to hurt. They sat in the main cabin of the Gulfstream, Adrian and Cassian at a small table near the forward galley, Marcus left on the tarmac with a cup of coffee from one of the Rourke men who had produced it wordlessly, efficiently, like hospitality was a security protocol. The interior of the jet was immaculate and nearly silent. No music, no art on the walls. A man named Dre sat in the rear seat with a laptop open and didn't look up once. Cassian poured 2 glasses of water and pushed one toward Adrian. No alcohol offered. Adrian noticed. Alara's father was Tomas Voss, Cassian said. The name meant nothing. Adrian opened his mouth to say so. He built the Eastern logistics network of what people outside our circle call the Rourke Empire. I was my father's closest ally, his architect, the man who turned a regional organization into something that moves capital across 11 countries. Cassian's voice carried no pride in this. It was information, delivered as information. 13 years ago, someone inside the organization decided that Tomas had become too valuable to share power with. He was killed in what looked like a car accident outside Salzburg. Adrian sat very still. Alara was 19, Cassian continued. She already knew enough about what our family did that she couldn't be left exposed. But she also hadn't been trained, hadn't been prepared, and we had no way of knowing how deep the betrayal went. So my father made a decision. He paused. We hid her. Gave her a new name, her mother's surname, Voss, moved her to Chicago, set her up with documentation, a background, a life that could withstand scrutiny. You gave her a false identity. We gave her a surviving one. Cassian met his eyes. She was going to be a target. Anyone connected to Tomas was a target. We needed her invisible until we understood who had ordered his death. Adrian's hands were flat on the table. He was trying to organize something in his mind. The woman he had known for 10 years, the woman he had just signed away, laid over this information like a transparency over a photograph. The 2 images kept refusing to align. She never told me any of this, he said. She was never supposed to. For 10 years. That was the arrangement. Her safety depended on her disappearance. If she had told you, Cassian paused, choosing his words with what seemed like practiced care, you would have become a liability. And you were not at the time a man who understood how to manage that kind of liability. The insult was measured and clean. Adrian felt it land. When did that change? Adrian asked. 2 years ago, when we finally identified who had ordered Tomas's death. The threat structure shifted. She was no longer in the same danger. Cassian turned the water glass once between his palms. We gave her the option to tell you then. She didn't. No. A beat. She said she didn't think you'd believe her. The rain hit the windows in long, diagonal lines. Somewhere outside, the Escalade's engines were idling. Adrian thought about the night Alara had sat across from him at the kitchen table, 2 years ago, almost exactly, now that he counted it, and started a sentence with his name, just his first name, Adrian. And he'd been on his phone and he'd said, yeah, 1 second without looking up. And she'd waited, and he'd never looked up, and eventually she'd stood up and started washing the dishes. He hadn't remembered that until this moment. What do you want from me? Adrian asked. Nothing. Cassian said it simply. I'm not here for you, Mr. Veilhart. I'm here because Alara's position within the family has now been formally acknowledged. Her inheritance, her father's stake in the organization, his seat at the table, his legacy, comes to her in full. We came to bring her home. She doesn't need your home, Adrian said, and he heard how that sounded even as he said it. Cassian heard it too. He didn't react. Where is she? Adrian said. She left the attorney's office and went directly to the hotel where we had her car. She's been briefed. He glanced at the watch on his wrist. Expensive, old, not ostentatious. She boards in 40 minutes. She's leaving tonight. Yes. Adrian pushed back from the table. I need to talk to her. That, Cassian said, is up to her. The hotel was a 40-minute drive in clear traffic. Adrian's driver cut it to 26. He tried calling her twice. Both calls went to voicemail. Not rejected, just unanswered, which was somehow worse. He left no messages because there was nothing that fit in a message. There was too much that needed a room and a door closed and no timer running. The lobby of the Ashworth Hotel was quiet at this hour. A concierge at the front desk recognized him. People usually did, and started to rise. Don't, Adrian said, not breaking stride. He knew the room number because he'd called her attorney's assistant on the drive over and used a tone of voice he wasn't particularly proud of. The assistant had given him the number. He took the elevator to the 9th floor, walked the corridor. The carpet was thick and absorbed the sound of his steps, so when he arrived at room 914, it felt like arriving without warning, which he supposed was accurate. He knocked. Silence. Then, "Who is it?" Her voice through the door. Flat. Not startled. As if she'd been awake, sitting, waiting for something. Not necessarily him, just something. "It's me," he said. A pause so long he nearly knocked again. The door opened. Elara Voss, who had been his wife for 10 years, who was now technically no longer his wife as of approximately 3 hours ago, stood in the doorway in dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, her eyes clear and dry and completely unreadable. She looked like herself. She looked like someone he had spent a decade failing to actually see. She didn't say anything. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You had 10 years to talk to me." The words weren't vicious. They were just accurate. Elara had a gift for that, for precision without theater, for saying the true thing in a way that left no room for it to be misunderstood. It had annoyed him once. He understood now that it was probably the sharpest thing about her. "Can I come in?" She considered this for a moment, genuinely considered it, in the way she considered most things, which was to say not quickly, and then she stepped aside. The room was spare and clean. A single bag sat packed near the closet. A dark coat was folded over the back of the chair. Everything ready. Everything already in its final position. Adrian came in and stood near the window. He didn't sit. He wasn't sure he'd earned that yet. "Cassian Rourke told me about your father," he said. Elara sat on the edge of the bed. Not tense, just careful, the way someone is careful when they've decided that this conversation has a fixed length and they intend to see it through without giving more than it requires. "He told you some of it," she said. "How much more is there?" She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Old, complicated, the kind of thing that doesn't compress into words easily. "More than you'd want to hear tonight," she said, "and probably more than I want to explain." Adrian put his hands in his pockets. He had a rehearsed version of this. He'd run it in his head in the car. Something about misunderstanding, about Victor's influence, about how things had changed. He found now that he couldn't locate the words. They had been designed for a smaller situation than the one he was actually standing in. "The documents," he said instead. "The ones my attorneys found last week." He watched her face. "The shell accounts. The bridge funding from 2018. The refinancing arrangement that kept Veilhart Capital from folding before the Meridian deal." She said nothing. "That was you," he said. "Adrian, was that you?" A silence. "Yes," she said. He had known it already. Knowing it and hearing it were different. "How?" he said. "We were broke. I was under investigation. The banks wouldn't touch. My father's family still had reach." She said it plainly, without making it a revelation, more like a correction than a confession. Not loudly, through intermediaries. It was structured carefully so nothing would trace back to you or to them, but the capital was real and the arrangements were legal. She paused. "It was enough to hold the company until the Meridian deal closed. You saved the company. You rebuilt the company." She looked at him steadily. "What I did kept it from being dismantled before you got the chance. Why didn't you tell me?" She tilted her head very slightly. "Would you have accepted it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, really, because the answer was both yes and no, and the no was heavier, and they both knew it. "You were proud," she said, and again, not as an attack, just as a fact. You were already sensitive about the investigation, about what people thought, about whether anyone was going to see you as weak. If I had told you that I'd quietly arranged financing through a family you didn't know I had, she stopped. It would have become an argument about control, and I needed it to work, not to become an argument. Adrian turned toward the window. The city below was ordinary and indifferent. Taxis, wet streets, a couple sharing an umbrella outside a restaurant. Victor, he said. You know about Victor. I've known about Victor for 3 years. He turned back. What do you know? I know he's been building a position to take the company from you since 2021. Her voice was even, precise. I know he's been leveraging your trust to redirect institutional partners. I know that at least 2 board members are now more loyal to him than to you, and I know that the restructuring proposal he's going to bring to you next month contains language that would effectively transfer voting control within 18 months. The room felt slightly smaller. You have documentation, Adrian said. I have documentation. Why didn't you? He stopped. Because again, he already knew. She had tried to tell him something, had tried multiple times in ways he'd mistaken for her general quietness, her hovering, her low-level worry that he'd attributed to anxiety or neediness or whatever convenient word he'd had available that particular week. I put a file together 8 months ago, Ilara said. I was going to give it to you. I planned to. She looked at the packed bag near the closet, then back at him. Then Victor had lunch with you in April, and whatever he told you, he told me you'd been interfering with the Holden partnership, Adrian said. The words tasted wrong now, like something that had been fine in the dark and wasn't fine in the light. I know what he told you. She didn't say it angrily, just quietly, with the tiredness of someone who has watched a thing go wrong for months and was unable to stop it. I know exactly what he told you, because it was calibrated. It was designed specifically to make you feel like I was undermining you. She paused. And it worked. It had worked. Adrian sat down in the chair near the window. He hadn't meant to, but his legs made the decision without him. Where's the file? He said. My attorney has a copy, Ilara said, and there's a drive in the hotel's safe. You can have it. She said it without resentment, practically, the way you hand someone a document they need. It won't be enough on its own. Victor's careful, but it's a starting point. He's going to move fast when he realizes you're gone. I know. He knows you know, Adrian said, and he felt the edges of that shape, the actual geometry of the situation Victor had constructed. He pushed for the divorce because as long as you were in the picture, as long as I was in the picture, I was a problem he couldn't resolve cleanly, she said. Getting you to file was the neatest solution. Discredit me with you, remove me from proximity to the company, and eliminate the one person who'd been watching him closely enough to catch what he was doing. Adrian put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. I am so sorry, he said. It came out with difficulty. Not because he didn't mean it, but because he did, and meaning it didn't fix any of what he was seeing now. The full shape of 10 years, the full cost of his inattention, the woman sitting on the edge of the bed who had spent a decade solving problems he didn't know he had. Ilara looked at him, just looked. She didn't tell him it was okay. She didn't offer the absolution he hadn't earned. You should take the drive, she said finally, and you should call Paul Deegan at Veilhart's legal team before Victor tries to call the board. You know Paul? I've known Paul for 6 years. We've spoken occasionally. A brief pause. He's loyal to the company, not to Victor. Start with him. Adrian reached into his jacket and found his phone. He didn't move to make the call yet. There was still something unfinished, some piece of it not yet said. Are you actually leaving tonight? He asked. Yes. And he struggled with the sentence. You're going with Cassian Rourke. Not with him, she said carefully. Back to something that was always mine to go back to. There's a difference. She met his eyes. Cassian is a complicated man, but he came personally, and that means something in their world. It means this is taken seriously. My father's position, my inheritance, that's not ceremonial. It's real, and it carries weight. She paused. Weight I'm only beginning to understand. Are you scared? She thought about it honestly. He could see her doing it, that careful internal accounting she did before she said anything about how she actually felt. A little, she said. But it's the right kind of scared. She looked at her hands briefly. The kind where you're walking towards something instead of away from it. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the hotel, an elevator chimed. Adrian Veilhart sat in a chair in a hotel room in the city where he had built his empire, across from the woman who had helped keep it standing, and understood, fully, for the first time with nothing left to rationalize, exactly what he had done. He'd been a fool, not a dramatic, operatic fool, the ordinary kind, the kind that doesn't know what it has until it's sitting in a packed room that's about to empty. "The drive," he said finally. "I'll get it from the front desk." "Safe code is 2209, she said. "September 22nd, the day you got the Meridian contract." He looked at her. "I remember things," she said simply. "I always did." She stood up, and the movement was the punctuation, the end of this particular page. She picked up the dark coat from the chair with practiced quiet, settled it over her arm. "Adrian," she said. He looked up. "Paul Deegan. Tonight. Don't wait until morning." She said it the way she'd said everything important over the years. Without drama, without needing him to acknowledge that she was right. "Victor is going to find out I'm gone by midnight. He's going to move." Adrian stood. He nodded once. She crossed the room, and she paused for just a moment at the door. Not looking back, just pausing, the way you do when you're leaving somewhere you lived in long enough that the doorframe knows you. Then she was gone. And Adrian stood alone in the empty room with the sound of the elevator chiming down the hall. And in the safe was a drive that would start a war. And on his phone was a number he needed to call. And outside on a private airfield, a jet was waiting for a woman who had spent a decade being underestimated. He sat back down. He called Paul Deegan. It rang twice. "Paul," he said, when the man picked up, sleep-rough and confused. "I know what time it is. I need you to listen to me very carefully." Outside the hotel, in a black car idling at the curb, Alara Voss looked at nothing for a long moment, her hands in her lap, her coat folded beside her. The driver didn't speak. The rain was quieting. She had not cried in the room. She would not cry now. There had been a version of herself, years ago, who had, more than once, in bathrooms and parked cars, and once in a stairwell, at a company event while the man she'd married laughed loudly at something just through the wall. That woman had not disappeared. She was still in there somewhere. But she had been asked to wait a long time. Now it was her turn. The car pulled away from the curb, and Alara Voss moved through the wet streets of the city, toward an airfield, toward a man who had once made a promise to her father, toward something older and larger and more truly hers than anything she'd built in the 10 quiet years of her vanishing. The night was still around her. The city didn't notice. It never does, with the quiet ones. Paul Deegan showed up at Veilhart Capital's legal offices at 2:14 in the morning with coffee he'd bought from a gas station, an expression on his face that suggested he'd already started grieving something. He was 53, Paul. Thick through the shoulders, gray at the temples, the kind of lawyer who had survived 3 decades of corporate warfare by being the least dramatic person in any given room. He set the coffee on Adrian's desk without offering any, sat down without being invited, and looked at the drive in Adrian's hand the way a doctor looks at a scan result he already suspects isn't good. "How long have you had that?" Paul said. 3 hours. "And you're just now calling me." Adrian stopped. "It's complicated." "It's always complicated with you?" Paul reached across and took the drive. He turned it over once in his fingers. "Alara gave you this." "Yes." Paul didn't react visibly. He plugged the drive into his laptop and sat very still while it loaded. The only sound in the office, the low hum of the building's ventilation, and the occasional sweep of headlights from the street below. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. Adrian watched his face and learned nothing from it. Paul had a face designed to reveal nothing, which was most of what he was paid for. Then Paul said quietly, "Jesus." "Yeah," Adrian said, "but this is 3 years of documentation, apparently." "Adrian?" Paul looked up. "This isn't just about the board votes. He's been redirecting revenue from the Holden partnership through a subsidiary you don't have visibility into. That's not a takeover play. That's theft." "I know. This has criminal exposure." "I know. If he finds out you have this before we've secured the board position." Paul stopped, and in the pause was everything neither of them wanted to say. He turned back to the screen. How many people know Ilara is gone? Cassian Rourke's people. Her attorney. Now you. Paul's jaw tightened slightly at the name. You said Rourke on the phone, the Rourke family. Yes. And Ilara is Tomas Voss's daughter. Yes. Paul sat back in his chair. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people do when they're reorganizing a significant amount of information very quickly. Then he looked back at Adrian. She never told you? No. She told me, Paul said. The office went very quiet. Adrian set his own coffee down on the edge of the desk. Excuse me. 2 years ago. Paul met his eyes without flinching. She came to me because she'd identified what Victor was doing, and she needed to understand whether she could act on the information through proper channels without exposing herself. Her identity, her background. He paused. She trusted me to hold it. She trusted you. Adrian kept his voice level with some effort. My attorney. She trusted you and not me. She was trying to protect you. From what? From making a mistake. Paul said it simply, without apology. If she'd come to you directly with this, with evidence against your closest business partner, coming from a woman you were already starting to pull away from, what would you have done, honestly? Adrian didn't answer. You would have questioned her motives, Paul said. You would have said she was jealous of the partnership or threatened by Victor's influence. You would have found a way to make it about your marriage instead of the crime. He held Adrian's gaze. She knew that, so she worked through me. For 2 years. Yes. Adrian stood up and walked to the window. The city was still dark, still wet, still indifferent. He could feel his own pulse in his temples, which happened only when he was either furious or frightened, and right now he wasn't entirely sure which one it was. She built the whole case, he said, without turning around, and she handed it to me on her way out the door. That's correct. And you let her. She's not a child, Adrian. She made her choices. Paul's voice was careful, but not soft. The question right now is what we do with what she left behind. Adrian turned back from the window. We move tonight, before Victor hears anything. We can't move tonight. We need to verify the board positions first. If we go to Hargrove and Chen before we know which way they're leaning, we tip Victor off. How long? 24 hours. Maybe 36. Victor's going to know she's gone by morning. I know. Paul closed the laptop. Which means we need to be ahead of his next move, not behind it. He's going to spin this. Ilara's disappearance, your divorce, all of it. He's going to use it to make you look unstable to the board. He paused. Has he called you tonight? Adrian checked his phone. 2 missed calls, both from Victor Halden, both in the last 40 minutes. He turned the phone so Paul could see the screen. Paul looked at the calls and said nothing for a moment. Don't return them tonight. He's going to keep calling. Let him. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, Paul said, standing and picking up his untouched gas station coffee. You meet with him, and you give him nothing. You let him talk. You watch what he's afraid of. He moved toward the door, then stopped. And Adrian, when this is over, and when you have the space to think clearly about it, I want you to understand something. Adrian waited. What Ilara did for this company, for you, over the last 10 years, she didn't have to do any of it. Her family's money, her connections, her protection. She could have walked away from you in this whole situation the first year and been perfectly safe. He held the drive up briefly before slipping it into his jacket. She stayed because she chose to, and she built a case against a man who was robbing you blind and handed it over without asking for credit. He looked at Adrian steadily. That's worth understanding, not just feeling bad about. Actually understanding. He left. Adrian stood alone in his office at 2:43 in the morning and understood that he was in the middle of something that had been in motion for years, and he was only now seeing the shape of it. His phone buzzed. Victor again. He put it face down on the desk. Victor Halden's apartment occupied the entire 31st floor of a residential tower in the financial district. 12,000 square feet of curated minimalism, all glass and pale stone and carefully placed objects that communicated wealth without appearing to try. He collected things. Not art, exactly. More like proof. Proof that he'd been in certain rooms, known certain people, accumulated a life that justified the space it occupied. At 3 in the morning, Victor sat at his kitchen island in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a glass of water he hadn't drunk. And he was on the phone with a man named Royce, who handled certain information problems. "She's on the plane," Royce said. Victor turned the water glass slowly between his palms. "Confirmed. Gulfstream G700. Filed a flight plan out of Westbrook Airfield. Destination listed as Geneva. That's the front. Actual routing is still being tracked." A pause. "Cassian Rourke was on the ground personally." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then, "That changes things." "It changes a lot of things," Royce agreed. "If the Rourke family is formally reclaiming Tomas Voss's daughter, don't say the name on this line." "Right." Another pause. "If that's what's happening, and they're bringing her back into the fold with full standing, whatever she knows becomes an asset of the Empire, which means it's protected." "What does she know?" Victor said. "We're not sure of the extent." "Guess." A longer pause. "Enough. She was careful, but she was watching, and she had access to things inside the Veilheart structure that we didn't know about until recently." Royce's voice was neutral, the voice of a man delivering bad weather reports. "There's a possibility she's documented the redirect." Victor set the water glass down. He stared at the surface of the island, pale marble, cool and smooth. And he ran a calculation that he'd been running in various forms for 2 years, ever since he'd first understood that Alara Voss was not who she appeared to be. He'd known before Adrian did. He'd known, and he'd moved accordingly, carefully, in the way Victor always moved, by shaping the environment so that other people made the choices that served his purposes. Getting Adrian to file for divorce had been the cleanest move. Remove Alara from proximity to the company, damage Adrian's confidence in her, and eliminate the one witness with both access and motive. It had worked. For 6 weeks it had worked beautifully. He hadn't accounted for Cassian Rourke showing up in person. "Adrian called Paul Deegan tonight," Royce said. "We picked that up 20 minutes ago." Victor's jaw tightened. "How?" "Deegan's building has a security system with a third-party monitoring contract. We have a contact in the company." A pause that communicated something about the nature of that contact without stating it. "They met at the Veilheart Capital offices. They were there for roughly 40 minutes. Adrian has the documentation." Victor said it to himself as much as to Royce. "She gave it to him before she left." "That's the working assumption." Victor stood up and walked to the windows. 31 floors down, the city was dark and wet and moving with its usual indifferent nighttime business. He looked at it the way a man looks at a board when the pieces have shifted and he needs to restructure his thinking. He was not panicking. Victor Halden did not panic. It was one of the things he had trained out of himself deliberately, over years, the reptile response, the urge toward noise and motion when stillness and calculation served better. But there was something underneath the calculation now, something that had come in with Royce's mention of the Rourke name, and it wasn't quite panic, but it was adjacent to it. The Rourkes were not a variable he had priced into his model. "I need the board accelerated," Victor said. "The restructuring proposal goes to Hargrove by end of business tomorrow." "That's 3 weeks ahead of schedule. He'll know something's off." "He'll comply." Victor turned from the window. "Hargrove has exposure we can leverage. He knows that." "And Chen?" "Chen follows Hargrove. He always has." Victor picked up the water glass finally and drank. "What about the subsidiary accounts, the Meridian redirect?" "Currently clean from the outside. Would require subpoena-level access to trace." "Would require or does require?" Another pause. "Does. Unless someone had internal access and knew exactly what to look for." Victor set the glass down. "She did," he said quietly. Royce said nothing. "She knew exactly what to look for," Victor said, "because she understood the structure of that account better than Adrian ever did. She helped build the financing architecture in 2018. He paused. "I underestimated that." "We all did." "No." Victor's voice was even and precise. "I did. The rest of you didn't know enough about her to underestimate her." He turned back toward the island. "Get me everything on the Rourke organization's current legitimate holdings. Any business interest that intersects with Veilheart Capital's institutional partners. If Alara comes back into the Rourke structure with full standing, the first thing Cassian does is use those intersections as leverage." He picked up his own phone. "And I need you to find out whether Adrian made any additional calls tonight, anyone outside of Deegan. Give me an hour. You have 40 minutes. He ended the call. He stood in his kitchen alone, and for the first time in years, Victor Halden felt the specific discomfort of being 2 moves behind someone he'd thought he'd already removed from the board. He did not like it. He picked up the phone again and called a different number. This one rang 5 times before a voice answered, rough, half awake, the voice of a man who'd been sleeping and was unhappy about it. I need you in the office by 6, Victor said. Bring Hargrove's file. It's 3 in the morning, Victor. I know what time it is, Daniel. 6 o'clock. He ended that call too. Then he sat back down at the island and stared at the water glass and thought about a woman he had spent 2 years maneuvering into invisibility, who had apparently spent those same 2 years watching him with the calm, sustained attention of someone who already knew how the story ended. He thought about what that meant. He didn't like what he came up with. The Gulf Stream hit cruising altitude somewhere over the Atlantic at 4:20 in the morning, and Alara Voss was not sleeping. She sat near the rear of the cabin with a cup of tea she'd barely touched, her feet tucked under her, a thin blanket across her legs, looking out the small oval window at the absolute dark below and the stars above and the nothing in between. Cassian was in the forward section with Dre, and a man she didn't know yet, speaking in low voices over a tablet. She could hear the cadence of it without the words, and the cadence was serious, which meant something had moved while they were on the ground. She'd known it would. Victor was fast. He was never the smartest person in any room he entered, but he was consistently faster than people expected. And he had the specific advantage of a man with nothing personal at stake. No loyalty, no grief, no love that could slow him down or complicate his judgment. She thought about Adrian alone in that office with the drive, calling Paul Deegan in the middle of the night. She thought about whether she'd done enough. She had run the calculation 100 times over the last 6 weeks, ever since she'd understood the divorce was real and not just another rotation of his moods. She had a system for her own emotional processing, had built it, necessarily, over years of living adjacent to someone who didn't notice, which involved letting the feeling exist fully for exactly as long as it needed to, and then setting it in a particular place in her chest where it couldn't interfere with her thinking. The grief about Adrian was in that place now, real, present, not consuming. She was still angry. That was different from the grief, and she didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. Not the hot, reactive anger of the first few weeks. The kind that made her drive to the company building 3 separate times and sit in the parking lot for 20 minutes before turning around and going home. This was the steadier kind, the kind that had settled into something useful. The cabin shifted slightly. Cassian moved through it, stepping over a bag near the galley, and sat down in the seat across from her. He looked the way he usually looked, contained, present, not particularly readable. He had a glass of water in one hand. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll sleep in Geneva." "We're not going to Geneva." She looked at him. "I filed the flight plan to Geneva as a decoy. We're going to Lisbon. There's a house. Secure, private, and we control the perimeter." He glanced out the window briefly. "Victor Halden has ears in places I'd rather not test right now. He already knows I'm gone." "Yes. And he's moving." Cassian turned back to her. "He called Hargrove 20 minutes ago. We picked that up from a contact in Hargrove's building. The call was short, 2 minutes, but the timing tells us enough. He's accelerating the restructuring vote." Alara processed this. If Hargrove moves by end of business tomorrow, Adrian loses board control within the week. Yes. Cassian watched her face. "The documentation you gave him is strong, but it's not fast. Legal action takes time. The board vote doesn't. Paul Deegan knows which buttons to push with Hargrove," she said. "If Adrian gets to him before Victor does, that's a close race." Cassian said it without sugarcoating it. "Adrian is smart and Deegan is competent, but Victor has a head start and existing leverage." He paused. "And we have something that complicates this further." She waited. "Your father's stake in the financial structure of what became Veilhart Capital, the 2018 bridge arrangement, was never fully anonymous." He watched her carefully. "There are records, buried but real, that trace the capital source. If Victor finds them before this is resolved, he uses them to reframe the whole thing," Alara said. "My involvement, the family's involvement. Suddenly it's not Alara protecting the company, it's the Rourke family infiltrating a rival structure." That's the narrative he'd build, yes. She absorbed this. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the dark continued, absolute and enormous and completely unhelpful. "Can we seal those records?" she asked. "We're working on it." Cassian turned the water glass slowly. "But Alara, you need to decide something before we land." She looked at him. "Your father's seat at the table, accepting it in full means you're a visible figure within the organization. That visibility protects you in some ways and exposes you in others." He held her gaze. "If Victor identifies you as a Rourke asset with standing, he escalates. He doesn't just try to take Adrian's company, he tries to neutralize you directly." "You mean he comes after me?" "I mean he tries." Cassian's voice was flat and certain. "He won't succeed, but the attempt would create noise, and noise creates complications." He paused. "The alternative is that you take your father's legacy in a limited capacity, private, administrative, away from the operational front, and we handle Victor's threat from the outside." Alara looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me," she said, "whether I want to hide again." Cassian said nothing. "After 10 years of being invisible," she said quietly, "you're giving me the option to stay invisible. I'm giving you a choice," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He put the water glass down. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, Alara. Your father was the kind of man who made decisions for the people around him because he believed he knew better. He was usually right. It didn't always end well." He held her eyes. "I'm not that kind of man." She looked back out the window. Below them was the ocean, dark and vast and indifferent, the same as always. She had spent a great deal of her life navigating things that were dark and vast and indifferent, usually without anyone noticing that she was doing it, which had been both the requirement and the cost. "Full standing," she said. Not loudly. Not as a declaration, just as the answer. Cassian nodded once. "Then we have work to do before Lisbon," he said, and stood and moved back toward the forward section. Alara picked up the cold tea, held it, set it back down. She thought about the moment in that hotel room when Adrian had looked at her across 10 years of chosen blindness and said, "I am so sorry." And she had not told him it was okay because it wasn't. And she had not told him it was unforgivable because that wasn't accurate either. It was just true. It was just the thing that had happened. The way the ocean below her was just the thing that was there. She was done being the person who absorbed true things quietly and asked for nothing. She reached across the seat beside her and pulled her bag onto her lap. Inside, beneath a change of clothes and her passport, was a small notebook, dark blue, worn at the corners, filled with 3 years of notes in her careful, compressed handwriting. Observations, dates, account numbers, names, the full architecture of what Victor Halden had built, and what he'd used Adrian's trust to construct it on. She opened it to a page near the back. A name she hadn't shown Paul Deegan, hadn't shown anyone. Daniel Marsh, Victor's chief financial strategist, the man who had actually executed the redirects, structured the subsidiary, and maintained the fiction of a clean audit trail. Daniel Marsh, who had a son in a custody dispute he was losing. Daniel Marsh, who had been making a separate set of payments, small, irregular, careful, to an account that had nothing to do with Victor's operation and everything to do with a woman named Sasha Reeve, who worked in the office of a federal regulatory body and who had, twice in the last 18 months, delayed proceedings that would otherwise have flagged the Holden partnership for review. Alara had found it 4 months ago. She had not included it in the drive she gave Adrian. She had kept it, not out of selfishness, out of precision, because the information about Marsh and Sasha Reeve was the kind of leverage that, used at the wrong moment, would burn everything. Used at the right moment, it would end Victor Halden so completely that he would have no surface left to stand on. She just had to be sure of the moment. She closed the notebook. She looked at the dark outside the window and felt, for the first time and longer than she could accurately remember, something that was not patience and not endurance, and not the particular exhaustion of waiting for something you're not allowed to want. It felt like readiness. At 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, Alara Voss made a decision she had been building toward for 3 years without knowing it was a decision, and the shape of it was simple and clean and irreversible. She was done protecting people from the consequences of underestimating her. Victor Halden had one move left. He just didn't know she'd already seen it, already countered it, already written the ending. Not in anger, but in the same quiet, systematic way she did everything that actually mattered. Below her, Adrian Veilhart was sitting in an office with half the information he needed and a clock running down toward morning. And somewhere in a building in the financial district, Victor Halden was recalculating with a variable he still didn't fully understand. The plane flew east into the dark. The notebook sat closed on her lap. And Alara Voss, daughter of Thomas Voss, heir to a legacy built in shadows, looked out at the nothing below and waited. Not the old waiting, the hollow kind, the kind that costs you something every day you do it, but the waiting of someone who has already won and simply needs the board to catch up to the outcome. The cabin was quiet around her. Outside, the first gray edge of dawn was beginning at the far horizon, barely visible, barely real, just the faintest suggestion that the dark had limits after all. She saw it. She was the only one awake to see it. The call with Adrian lasted 19 minutes. When it ended, Alara set the phone on the windowsill and stood very still, looking at the river below, and she ran through the conversation the way she ran through everything, linearly, precisely, stripping it down to what was real versus what was noise. Adrian was scared. That was real. Paul was working. That was real. Victor had moved faster than even she had predicted, and Hargrove was already reading a restructuring framework that had taken months to build in secret. That was also real, and it was the part that sat wrong. She picked up the phone and walked to the basement. Cassian was at the communications table with Dre and a woman named Petra who handled intelligence sourcing for the Rourke organization's European operations. Compact, 50s, gray haircut practically short, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and was immediately underestimated and had long since stopped minding. Petra had a background in financial forensics that predated her work for the Rourkes by 15 years and a directness that Alara had liked immediately when they'd been introduced the previous night. "I need the Stratham advisory contract," Alara said, coming down the last step. "The one Victor ran through the Holden subsidiary. I need to know when the first payment was made." Petra looked up from her screen. "I can get that. Give me 30 minutes. I need it in 15. Alara sat down at the far end of the table. "And I need a timeline of every contact between Victor Halden and Wallace Hargrove over the last 18 months. Not calls, physical meetings. Locations, durations, who else was present?" Cassian watched her from across the table. "What did Adrian tell you?" "Victor called an emergency board session for Thursday. He's framing the divorce as a material governance risk." She opened the notebook on the table in front of her. "He had a restructuring framework ready to hand Hargrove this morning. Something that took months to prepare." She looked at Cassian. "I knew about the Stratham contract. I knew about the framework. What I didn't know was the timing of when he planned to deploy it." "And the timing concerns you. The timing tells me he had a trigger," she said. "Something that told him to move now, ahead of the schedule I anticipated. Something changed in the last 2 weeks." She looked down at the notebook. "I need to know what it was." Petra's fingers were already moving across her keyboard. Cassian leaned forward. "Walk me through what you're thinking." "Victor is not impulsive. Every move he makes is calculated and sequenced. He's been building toward this board play for months, and he had a specific timeline. I know that because the Stratham framework was drafted in phases, the final phase completed in September. He wasn't planning to deploy until late December at the earliest." She pressed her thumbnail against the edge of the notebook's cover, a small, unconscious gesture. "Something accelerated him, and whatever it was, it happened recently enough that I didn't see it coming." "The divorce," Cassian said. "The divorce was part of his plan. He pushed for it, engineered it. He wouldn't accelerate his own timeline over something he controlled." She shook her head. "Something surprised him, something he didn't control." The room was quiet except for Petra's keyboard and the low electronic hum of the equipment around them. Then Dre looked up from the second monitor, his voice careful and flat. "The Geneva filing." Everyone looked at him. Dre was 29, the youngest person in the room by 15 years, and he had the specific quality of someone who processed information faster than he spoke, which meant when he spoke, it was usually worth hearing. He turned his monitor so Alara and Cassian could see the screen. "The Rourke organization filed a formal recognition of Alara's standing with the Geneva Financial Oversight Body 6 days ago," he said. "Standard procedure for inheritance claims of this scope. It creates a public record." He paused. "The filing is technically confidential, but Geneva oversight records are accessible to parties with demonstrated financial interest in intersecting entities. He looked at Alara. Victor has a holding company registered in Geneva with a declared interest in two institutional partners that also appear in Valhart Capital's portfolio. The silence in the room took on a different quality. He saw the filing, Alara said. He would have been notified automatically, Dre said, 6 days ago. Alara sat back in her chair. She felt the information move through her. Not shock exactly, more like the specific sensation of a piece you've been holding in your hand suddenly showing you which edge it fits. 6 days ago. Victor had known for 6 days that she was formally re-entering the Rourke structure, and he had spent those 6 days accelerating everything, the board play, the Hargrove approach, the deployment of the Stratham framework, because he understood what it meant. He had known before she'd even left the country. He wasn't reacting to the divorce, she said quietly. He was reacting to me. Cassian said nothing. He was watching her with that contained, assessing attention he'd had since the first night. Not cold, but precise. The look of a man who is waiting to see what you do with the thing you've just learned. The filing, she said. Can it be amended? The timing of formal activation? Dre shook his head slightly. It's already in the record. Amending it would require a withdrawal and refiling, which would itself create a record and a gap in standing that could be legally exploited. He paused. The filing was correct procedure. The problem is that the confidentiality tier it was classified under is lower than we'd have chosen if we'd anticipated Victor having that Geneva registration. Whose decision was the classification tier? Alara said. A pause. Dre glanced at Cassie. Mine, Cassian said. She looked at him. I made the call on the confidentiality classification 3 weeks ago. His voice was even. Not defensive, not apologetic, just accurate. I had reviewed Victor's holdings and I didn't have the Geneva registration in my picture. Dre pulled it yesterday. He held her gaze. I missed it. The admission sat in the room without theater. Alara looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Petra had stopped typing and Dre was looking at his screen with unnecessary focus. So Victor has known for 6 days, she said. Yes. Which means the timing of everything, my departure, Adrian's divorce, the board session, none of it surprised him. He was already moving. Yes. And you filed the decoy flight plan to Geneva. A beat. Yes, Cassian said. We flew to Lisbon. She kept her voice level. But the decoy plan was Geneva, the same city where the filing originated. If Victor already had the Geneva filing in hand, and then a flight plan appears heading to Geneva the same night Alara Voss boards a Rourke jet, he wouldn't read it as a decoy, Cassian said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't quite certainty. He'd read it as confirmation. Confirmation that I'm going to Geneva to manage the filing, to formalize the standing claim in person. She pressed both hands flat on the table. He thinks I'm in Geneva right now. Yes. And he has people in Geneva. The silence this time was very different. Cassian looked at Dre. A single look, the kind that contained a full conversation. Dre was already on a second keyboard, his fingers moving fast. I need a sweep of our Geneva contacts, Cassian said. Anyone Victor could have positioned in the last 6 days. Financial district, the oversight building, the 3 hotels we typically use. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an underneath current that hadn't been there before. Now, Dre. Running it, Dre said. Alara stood up. She walked to the far end of the basement, to the narrow window that looked out at the stone wall of the perimeter. She stood there with her back to the room and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way she'd trained herself to breathe when the thing happening was worse than she'd planned for. This was worse than she'd planned for. Not catastrophically, not unrecoverably. But the gap between her model and Victor's actual position was larger than it should have been, and that gap had a specific consequence. He was not, as she'd calculated on the plane, 2 moves behind her. He was level, possibly ahead on the Geneva vector. She heard Petra's keyboard stop. She heard Petra say quietly, Cassian. She turned around. Petra's face had done something small and controlled. The kind of change in a professional face that means the information is bad enough to register even on someone who processes bad information daily. She turned her monitor. A financial record, a wire transfer log. Alara crossed the room and looked at it. The transfer had originated from a blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands. Small amount. $40,000, unremarkable on its own. The destination account was registered to a consulting firm in Zurich that Alara didn't recognize. The consulting firm, she said. Shell, Petra said. 3 layers deep, but the terminal entity is a man named Gideon Farr. He does contract intelligence work, surveillance, information brokering, occasionally things that are harder to categorize. She paused. He's worked for the Rourke organization twice in the last decade. Low level, deniable. Alara looked at the date of the transfer. 11 days ago. And the originating trust, she said. Can you trace the beneficial owner? Working on the second layer now, Petra said. But the first layer names a director. She pointed to a line on the screen. A man named Royce. No last name in the registration, but the signature style and the registration date match a trust that was used in... She stopped. In what? Cassian said. His voice had gone very quiet. Petra looked at him. In a transaction connected to the Halden Group's private holdings in 2019. The room absorbed this. Alara felt it move through her chest like cold water. Victor had hired Gideon Farr 11 days ago, before the Geneva filing, before the flight plan, before any of the moves of the last week. 11 days ago, when Alara was still in the country, still in the hotel, still technically Adrian's wife, Victor had already deployed an intelligence contractor with Rourke-specific experience. He didn't react to the Geneva filing, she said. It came out very quiet. He was already moving before the filing. He knew before the filing. She looked at Cassian. How? She said. The word was not loud. It didn't need to be. It sat in the room and took up all the available space. Cassian held her gaze, and she watched him run the same calculation she was running, watched him arrive at the same point, watched his face do the thing faces do when they arrive somewhere they didn't want to go. Someone told him, Cassian said. Someone in your organization, she said. Yes. The word cost him something. She could see it, not in any dramatic way. Cassian Rourke did not do dramatic, but in the specific tension around his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has just confirmed his own worst hypothesis. How long have you been planning to bring me back? Alara said. Formally, 8 weeks. He held her eyes. Internally, the discussions began 4 months ago. 4 months. She let that sit. And in 4 months, someone inside the organization told Victor Halden that you were moving to reclaim Tomas Voss's daughter. She paused. Told him with enough specificity that he could hire a contractor with Rourke-specific experience before any of this became official. Yes. That's not a leak, she said. That's a source. Someone who knew the internal discussions, knew the timeline, knew enough about the significance to understand what it meant for Victor's play against Adrian. She looked at Dre, at Petra, back at Cassian. Who was in those discussions? Cassian said 3 names, quietly, without inflection. One of them was Dre. Alara looked at Dre. Dre was looking at his screen. His jaw was set and his shoulders were tight, and he was typing with the slightly over-deliberate focus of someone who is aware of being looked at. Dre, Cassian said. Dre stopped typing. The silence lasted 4 seconds. It wasn't me, Dre said. He said it to his screen, then turned to face the room. His face was younger than usual in this moment, stripped of the professional composure, just a 29-year-old in a room where everyone was looking at him. I want to be clear about that. It was not me. Then who was it? Cassian said. I don't know. A pause. But I know who else had access to the full internal timeline. He looked at Cassian. Marin. The name landed differently than the others. Alara didn't know the name. She looked at Cassian, and she could tell from the quality of his stillness that he did. Marin Voss, Cassian said. Not a question. She ran the preliminary assessment on Alara's standing claim, Dre said. Full access to the documentation. She was in 3 of the 4 internal meetings. He paused. And she resigned from the organization 14 days ago. Personal reasons, she said. I thought it was... He stopped. You thought it was what? Cassian said. I thought it was about the Zurich reassignment. She didn't want to relocate. Dre's voice was careful and unhappy. I didn't connect it to this. Where is she now? Cassian said. I don't know. Find out. Cassian's voice was still quiet, and it was, in its quietness, more alarming than if he'd raised it. He looked at Petra. Can you locate Gideon Farr's current position? I can try. He's good at not being findable. Try. He stood up and looked at Alara. She was still standing at the end of the table with the notebook in her hand. She'd picked it up at some point in the last few minutes without consciously deciding to. Her anchor, her constant. I'm sorry, he said. I should have run a tighter internal audit before we initiated this. She looked at him. Yes, you should have. He accepted that without comment. Victor knows I'm alive and connected to the Rourke organization, she said. He may know I'm not in Geneva, depending on how good Farr is. And he now has a structurally legitimate board play that moves in 4 days. She set the notebook down on the table. The Daniel Marsh leverage, the Sasha Reeve payments, that's still intact. Victor doesn't know I have it. Unless Marin knew about it, Dre said carefully. Alara thought about this. Marin had access to the standing claim documentation. She did not have access to the notebook. She touched its cover. Nobody had access to the notebook. It never left my physical possession. You're certain, Cassian said. I am certain. She met his eyes. It's the one thing I kept completely to myself. No copies, no photographs, no digital record of any kind. She paused. Because I knew, 4 months ago, that at some point something would go wrong in some direction I hadn't anticipated, and I needed one thing that was entirely mine. The room was quiet. So we still have the Marsh angle, Cassian said. We have it, but we have to use it differently now. She pulled the notebook toward her and opened it. The original plan was to use Marsh as a brake, apply pressure, slow Victor down, give Paul time to get to Chen. But if Victor has Farr in the field and a source inside this organization, he's not going to slow down for a threat against Marsh. He's going to accelerate. She looked at the page with Marsh's name on it, which means we don't use it as a brake. What do we use it as? Cassian asked. A detonator, she said. She looked up. We don't threaten Victor with what we know about Marsh. We go directly to Marsh. She kept her voice steady, working through it as she spoke. Marsh is not a true believer. He's a functionary, smart, careful, loyal to whoever protects his interests. If his interests shift, his loyalty shifts. She paused. Right now, Victor is the most dangerous thing in Marsh's world because Victor controls what happens to him if the Sasha Reeve payments come to light. But if Marsh understood that we already know, that the information exists regardless of Victor's protection, then Victor stops being his shelter. You want to flip Marsh, Cassian said. I want Marsh to walk into the Thursday board session and contradict Victor's financial projections from the inside. She said it simply, the way she said things when she'd run them enough times to be certain. Not as a whistleblower. That takes weeks of legal process we don't have. As a witness. Someone who, when board members start asking questions about the Holden subsidiary and the redirect, confirms that the numbers they're being shown don't match the numbers he knows. That destroys Marsh professionally, Petra said from across the table. Not if we structure it correctly. Alara looked at her. Marsh has a son in a custody dispute. The custody case hinges partly on financial stability, his income, his professional standing. If we offer a pathway that protects his employment record while extracting him from Victor's structure, we'd need a company willing to absorb him on short notice, Cassian said. The Rourke organization's legitimate holding arm has 3 portfolio companies in the financial sector. One of them is currently looking for a senior analyst. She held his gaze. I read the quarterly briefing you sent on the flight. A beat. Cassian looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile and not quite admiration, but was in the territory of both. You read the quarterly briefing at 4 in the morning. I read everything you give me, she said. That's been true since I was 19 and your father sent me my first file. Something moved across Cassian's face at that. Old and complicated. The kind of thing that surfaces when someone mentions a time that cost something. He looked away briefly. All right, he said. We approach Marsh, but we need to find him before Victor does. If Victor suspects Marsh is a weak point, he may already be managing that risk. Victor doesn't know we have the Sasha Reeve payments, she said. He has no reason to suspect Marsh is exposed. She paused. Yet. Then we move today. Cassian looked at Dre. I need Marsh's current location and his personal schedule for the next 48 hours. Not through any channel Marin had access to. Understood, Dre said, and the relief of having a concrete task was visible on his face even through his professionalism. Alara closed the notebook. She should have felt something like confidence at this point. She had a plan. She had the information advantage on the Marsh angle. She had Cassian's organization as infrastructure. The shape of the path forward was there, even if it was narrower than she'd wanted. But something was still sitting wrong. She picked up her phone. She looked at the last call from Adrian, 19 minutes, 43 seconds. She thought about the conversation, replaying it with the new information. Victor had known for at least 11 days, possibly longer. He'd had time to prepare, to position, to place far in the field. She thought about Paul Deegan. She thought about something Paul had said to her 2 years ago in his office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she'd first brought him into her confidence about Victor. She'd shown him the initial documentation, the first redirect, the subsidiary structure, and he'd looked at it for a long time, and then he'd said something that she'd taken as caution at the time, and now, replaying it, landed differently. "Be careful how much you put in writing," he'd said. "Paper has a way of finding the wrong hands." She had thought, at the time, that he meant Victor, that he was warning her to protect the documentation from discovery. Now she thought about the fact that Paul Deegan had known about her identity for 2 years, had known and had held it, had been the bridge between her and the company, the one person who connected her world to Adrian's, her information to the legal structure of Veilheart Capital. She thought about the fact that Victor's intelligence on the Rourke filing had arrived 11 days ago. She thought about when she had last spoken to Paul, 3 weeks ago, to tell him she had made the decision to formally accept the standing claim. She stood very still in the basement of the Lisbon house. Her heart was doing something slow and precise in her chest, the kind of beat that happens when your body understands something half a second before your mind catches up. "Cassian," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "The leak inside your organization," she said. "Maren Voss. She resigned 14 days ago." "Yes." "And Victor received the intelligence 11 days ago." She turned to face him. "That's a 3-day gap." Cassian was very still. "Maren wouldn't have gone directly to Victor," Alara said. "She's not connected to him. There's no pathway between them." She held his gaze. "She would have gone through someone who already had a relationship with Victor, someone she trusted enough to hand the information to and trust it would move correctly." The room had gone very quiet. "Someone with access to both worlds," Cassian said. "Yes." "A lawyer," he said. "Someone in Adrian's circle who Victor already had access to." The word lawyer sat in the air between them. Alara felt sick. She felt it the way you feel something that you know is true before you have the proof. In the stomach, in the back of the throat, in the specific coldness that comes with a betrayal you should have seen coming and didn't. "Paul Deegan has known about my identity for 2 years, she said. "He knew about the Rourke organization. He knew about the standing claim because I told him 3 weeks ago when I told him I'd made the decision." She paused. "He's been inside Adrian's company for 15 years. He has a relationship with every board member, including Hargrove." "And if Victor had Deegan," Cassian started. "If Victor had Deegan," she said, "then the drive I gave Adrian last night went directly into Victor's hands." She looked at the notebook on the table. Every piece of documentation on that drive. Victor knows what's on it. He's known since last night. Her voice was flat and precise, and underneath it was something enormous that she was keeping absolutely contained. "And Adrian is sitting in his office right now thinking he has a case, thinking Paul is working on his behalf, with no idea that the man he trusts completely is the reason Victor is 3 steps ahead of us." She picked up the phone. She called Adrian. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She looked at Cassian, and the thing she had been containing was visible now, not on her face, which was still composed, but somewhere behind her eyes, somewhere in the quality of how she was holding herself. "Get me to Adrian," she said. "Now, whatever it takes, whatever it costs." She picked up the notebook and held it against her chest like a thing she was protecting. "Because if Paul Deegan has been feeding Victor everything, every piece of evidence I spent 3 years building, then Adrian is not running a counterplay right now." She looked at Cassian. "He's walking into a trap with the man who built it standing right beside him." The first 3 calls to Adrian went to voicemail. The fourth call went to a number Alara had never used, a direct line she had memorized 18 months ago and written nowhere, a number that rang into the office of Valhart Capital's head of internal security, a former federal investigator named Cole Whitman, who had been hired 4 years ago and who Alara had quietly vetted at the time and found clean. Whitman picked up on the second ring. "This is Alara Voss," she said. "I need you to find Adrian Valhart right now and stay with him until I tell you otherwise. Do not let Paul Deegan into the same room as him. Do not explain why. Just do it." A pause. "Mrs. Valhart, Ms. Voss," she kept her voice level, "and I need you to do this in the next 4 minutes, Mr. Whitman, because the alternative is that your employer walks into a board meeting Thursday with a traitor standing at his shoulder and no idea the game was lost before it started. Do you understand me?" Another pause, shorter. "I understand you." "Good. Call me back on this number when you have eyes on him." She ended the call. Cassian was already on his own phone, speaking in a low, rapid cadence to someone in the New York operation. Dre had a second screen open, tracking flight options. Petra had not looked up from her terminal in 6 minutes. Alara stood at the basement table and pressed both hands flat against its surface and breathed. She counted the breaths not for calm was not the operative goal, but for precision. To keep the thinking clean. To not let the sick, cold weight of what Paul Deegan's betrayal meant collapse into the kind of emotion that cost you your next move. Paul had known about the Rourke organization for 2 years, had known about the standing claim for 3 weeks, had held the drive for 12 hours. She thought about every conversation she'd had with him, every document she'd walked him through, every name she'd given him, every piece of architecture she'd explained. She thought about his face across the desk from her in his office, careful, measured, apparently loyal, and she felt something in her chest that was not grief and not rage, but some combination of both that had no clean name. She had trusted him because she'd had to trust someone, because the plan required a bridge into Adrian's world that she couldn't be herself. Because Paul had been, for 2 years, the one person she'd believed was genuinely trying to protect the thing she'd built, and she had been wrong. Her phone rang. Whitman. "I have him," Whitman said. "He's in the conference room on 12. Deegan is with him." "Get Deegan out of the room." "On what grounds?" "Tell Adrian his car has been towed. Tell him anything. I need 60 seconds of separation." She was already moving toward the stairs. "And Whitman, when Deegan steps out, you go in and you stay in. Don't leave Adrian alone until you hear from me directly." "Copy." She took the stairs 2 at a time, phone to her ear, and she was already dialing Adrian's personal cell again before she hit the ground floor. This time it rang twice, and he picked up, his voice carrying the specific distraction of someone who was mid-sentence when the call came in. "Alara, don't react," she said. "Don't change your expression. Don't look at Paul." A beat. She could hear the quality of his breathing shift, the slight intake, the deliberate hold. "Okay," he said carefully. "Paul Deegan is the leak. He's been feeding Victor everything. The drive I gave you, the documentation, the board strategy. Victor has all of it." She kept her voice flat and fast. "Don't confront him. Don't give him anything new. When Whitman comes in, find a reason to end the meeting. I need you out of that room." "Alara." His voice was very controlled. Too controlled. The kind of control that costs something. "Are you certain?" "I am certain." A silence of perhaps 3 seconds. In it she heard the entire weight of what she was asking him to absorb. That the man sitting across from him, the man who had been his lawyer for 15 years, the man he had called at 2 in the morning because he trusted him absolutely, had been selling him out to the person trying to destroy him. "All right," Adrian said quietly. "I'll handle it." He ended the call. She stood in the front hallway of the Lisbon house with the phone in her hand and the morning light coming through the narrow windows, and she waited. 40 seconds. Her phone buzzed. A text from Whitman. "He's out? I'm in." She exhaled. Then she called Cassian back into the hallway. "We have a window," she said, "but it's small. The moment Paul realizes Adrian is pulling back, he goes to Victor, and Victor will know the Deegan channel is burned." She looked at Cassian. "Which means Victor stops waiting for information and starts acting on what he already has." "Thursday's board session," Cassian said. "He won't wait until Thursday." She shook her head. "If he knows we've identified Deegan, he moves immediately. He calls an emergency session, files the restructuring motion, and tries to get the vote before we can mount a response. She paused. We have maybe 18 hours. Then we use Marsh now, Cassian said. We use Marsh now. She looked at Dre, who had followed them up from the basement. Where is he? His office building in Midtown, Dre said. He got in at 7:45 this morning. He's still there. His building access card hasn't logged an exit. Is Victor in contact with him today? 2 calls this morning, both short. Last one was 40 minutes ago. She looked at Cassian. I need to be in that room with Marsh. You're in Lisbon. I know where I am. She held his gaze. Get me a secure video line into his office. Dre can handle the technical routing. I don't need to be in the room physically. I need him to see my face and understand that I know everything he thought was buried. She paused. Fear is faster than logic. If he's scared enough, he moves before he thinks about it too hard. Cassian was already nodding. We'll need someone on the ground to get the line into his office. Your New York team? Yes. How long? He looked at his watch. It was 9:47 in the morning Lisbon time, which made it 4:47 in the morning in New York. Marsh wouldn't be in his office for hours. He's in Midtown at 7:45. That gives us 3 hours to set up the channel, Dre said. Doable. Tight, but doable. Do it, Cassian said. Ilara went upstairs. She went to the room she'd been given. Small, whitewashed, a single bed and a chair, and a window looking out at the hillside. And she sat on the edge of the bed and she let herself have 60 seconds. 60 seconds of not calculating, not planning, not holding the shape of the entire situation in her head simultaneously. 60 seconds of just sitting with the fact that Paul Deegan had betrayed her, and that she had not seen it coming, and that it had cost something she couldn't fully quantify yet. She thought about the first time she'd met him, the careful office, the way he'd listened to her for 2 hours without interrupting, the way he'd said, at the end of it, I believe you, let's figure out what to do with this. She thought about how much she had needed to hear that. After years of being invisible, after years of protecting things without acknowledgement, after years of being the person who solved problems that no one knew existed, to have one person look at what she'd built and say, I believe you had meant something, had meant more than she'd admitted to herself. She had wanted to trust him, and so she had. 60 seconds. She stood up. She went back downstairs. Daniel Marsh's office was on the 22nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that housed 3 financial firms, a law practice, and a private equity group. His office was a corner unit. Dre had the building schematic on screen within 20 minutes of the request, with 2 windows, a desk that faced the door, and a private line that ran through the building's internal network rather than through Victor's company infrastructure. That last detail mattered. It meant the call could be routed in without Victor seeing it. At 7:52 in the morning New York time, a man from Cassian's ground team, young, suited, carrying a laptop bag and a service company ID that would pass a casual inspection, walked into the building, took the elevator to 22, and told the receptionist he was there to service the conference line in Mr. Marsh's private office. A work order had been submitted. The receptionist checked, found a work order that had been filed 40 minutes earlier by someone in Dre's chain, and nodded him through. 4 minutes later, Dre had a live video channel into Daniel Marsh's office. At 8:03, Ilara's face appeared on Marsh's private monitor. He had been sitting at his desk with a coffee and a document he'd been annotating. When the monitor activated, he looked up with the reflexive irritation of someone whose equipment was misbehaving. Then he saw her face and the irritation evaporated completely. He sat very still. She could see him clearly. The document in his hand, the coffee going forgotten, the color draining from a face that had been ordinary and functional a moment ago and was now the face of a man who had just understood that the specific thing he was most afraid of had arrived. "Good morning, Mr. Marsh," she said. He said nothing. His mouth moved slightly and then stopped. "I know about Sasha Reeves. I know about the payments. I know about the 2 regulatory delays. I know about the account in Zurich, and I know about the timestamp on the first transfer." She kept her voice measured, not threatening, just informational, the way you speak to someone when you want them to understand that your knowledge is complete and not performative. "I've known for 4 months. I've been deciding what to do with it." Marsh set the document down. His hand was not entirely steady. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was rough. He knew who she was. She could see that he knew. But he was buying himself time, which was what people did when they needed to think and couldn't. "I'm the person Victor Halden spent 2 years trying to make disappear," she said. "I'm also the person who has a complete record of everything you've done for him since 2021. She paused. "And I'm the person who is offering you a way out of this that doesn't end your career and your custody case simultaneously." He flinched at the custody case. Small, controlled, but visible. "You have 48 hours before the documentation I hold goes to a federal contact," she said. "After that, it's out of my hands. The Reeve payments constitute obstruction. You know that. And at the level of the regulatory body she works in, that's not a fine and a settlement. That's a criminal proceeding." She looked at him steadily. "Your son is 9 years old. His mother's attorney is already arguing financial instability. A criminal proceeding would resolve that custody case immediately and not in your favor." Marsh's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "Thursday's board session. When Victor presents the restructuring framework, I need you to flag the financial projections on the Holden subsidiary." She kept it simple, operational. "You don't have to testify. You don't have to be a whistleblower. You simply correct the numbers publicly, in the boardroom, in front of Hargrove and Chen. You say the projections are based on data you cannot verify, and you've identified discrepancies that require a full audit before any vote can proceed." She paused. "That's it, that's all." "That's not all," he said. His voice had steadied slightly. He was recalibrating, she could see it. "If I do that, Victor knows immediately. He burns everything, including anything that could implicate him, and he comes after me." "Victor will be managing 3 simultaneous crises by Thursday morning," she said. "His intelligence channel inside Veilhart Capital's legal team was identified in the last hour. His contractor in the field has been flagged, and the financing records from the 2018 bridge arrangement, which Victor planned to use to reframe my involvement as hostile infiltration, are being sealed through a Geneva filing amendment as we speak." She held his gaze. "Victor is not going to have the capacity to come after you." A silence. Marsh looked at her. He was doing the calculation. She could almost see the components of it moving across his face, the variables being weighed against each other. "Rourke Organization has a portfolio company looking for a senior analyst," she said. "The role is legitimate, well compensated, and the background check process is handled internally. Your employment record stays clean." She paused. "Your son needs you present. Not incarcerated, not disgraced, present." Marsh looked at the window. He looked at it for a long time. The city outside was already in full morning motion, the ordinary and different machinery of a day that didn't know or care what was happening inside this particular corner office. Then he looked back at her. "If I do this," he said, "and Victor finds a way around it anyway—" "He won't," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "I don't. That's the honest answer." She held his eyes. "But I know that if you don't do this, the Reeve documentation goes to a federal contact who has been waiting for exactly this kind of entry point into the Holden partnership for 2 years, and that outcome is certain." She paused. "This one is not certain, but it's the better bet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thursday morning," he said finally. "I'll flag the projections." "Thank you," she said. She ended the feed. She sat back from the screen and pressed both hands over her face for exactly 3 seconds. Then she dropped them. "Dre," she said. "Already routing confirmation to the New York team," he said. "And the Geneva amendment?" "Filing went through 20 minutes ago," Petra said. "The records are sealed." Alara stood up. She felt the exhaustion now. The first real wave of it, the kind that comes not when things are worse, but when the first segment of the response is complete and your body takes the opportunity to remind you that you've been running on cold tea and adrenaline for 14 hours. She didn't have the luxury of it yet. She pushed it down. "Adrian," she said to Cashin, "I need to talk to him again, properly, not in 30 seconds on a phone." "We have a secure line set up from the New York safe house," Cashin said. "Whitman can get him there." "Do it." Adrian Veilhart arrived at the safe house at 9:41 in the morning, which was a nondescript brownstone in a residential block in the West 50s that looked nothing from the outside like what it was, and he came in through the back entrance with Whitman at his shoulder, and the specific expression of a man who had been managing his own face very carefully for several hours and was now in a room where he didn't have to. He sat down across from the screen and looked at Alara's face and said, "Tell me everything." She told him. She told him about Marin Voss and the internal leak. She told him about Gideon Farr and the Geneva filing. She told him about the timeline that put Victor's knowledge at 11 days ahead of what they'd assumed. She told him about Paul. She told him about Paul last because it was the hardest, and she needed him to have the full context before it landed. When she finished, Adrian was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the table in front of him rather than the screen. His hands were flat on the surface. She could see the tendons in the backs of them. 15 years, he said. Yes. He was at my wedding, Adrian said. It came out strange, not accusing anyone, just locating the specific dimension of it. He was in the hospital when my father died. He was the first call I made when the SEC investigation started. A pause. He's my son's godfather. Elara said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would make it smaller or cleaner. Victor recruited him how long ago? Adrian said. We don't know yet. The Deegan channel may predate even my involvement with Paul. It's possible Victor had him before I ever walked into his office. She kept her voice steady. It's also possible Paul was legitimate for most of those years, and Victor found leverage at some point. We don't know. Does it matter? She thought about it. For criminal liability, yes. For what it means to you personally. She stopped. No, I don't think it matters. Adrian looked up at the screen. His face was doing something complicated and controlled, and she recognized it. It was the face he made when something had broken past the perimeter of the self-possession he maintained as a professional habit. She had seen it 3 times in 10 years. Once when his company was nearly dissolved. Once when his father died. Once, early in their marriage, when he had said something to her that he couldn't take back and knew it. I'm going to deal with Paul, he said, directly, today. Adrian? Not violently, he said, and there was something almost tired in it. But I'm going to look him in the face and I'm going to tell him what I know. I need to do that. A pause. I understand if that's not strategically optimal. She looked at him. It's not. If Paul knows his position is burned, he warns Victor. Victor already knows his position is burned. You burned it when you identified Deegan to Whitman. He held her gaze. He's going to know within hours regardless. I'd rather Paul hear it from me. She thought about it. He was right. The timeline on Victor's awareness was already running, and there was something in Adrian's voice that she recognized as non-negotiable in the specific way that certain things are non-negotiable, not because of strategy, but because of what a person needs to be able to live with themselves. Fine, she said, but Whitman stays in the room. Agreed. And after, I need you to go to Chen, not Hargrove. Chen directly. Don't call first, just go to his home. She leaned slightly forward. Tell Chen the truth about the 2018 financing. All of it. Tell him Elara Voss used family connections to keep the company solvent during the investigation, that it was legal, that she never took credit for it, and that the man who's been his partner on the board has been stealing from the company for 3 years. She paused. Chen has children. He's been with this company since the beginning. He's not a man who forgives being used. You think he'll vote against the restructuring? I think when he understands the full picture, he'll do more than that. He'll ask for an independent audit. She held his gaze. An independent audit kills the Thursday session entirely. Victor can't proceed with a vote while an audit is pending. Adrian absorbed this. He nodded once, a short and definitive motion. And Paul, she said, when you confront him, don't tell him about Marsh. Don't tell him about Chen. Don't tell him anything that's still in motion. I know, he said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one. The smallest possible acknowledgement of the 10 years of her saying things he already knew because she needed them said, and him being surprised sometimes that she'd been right to say them. Elara, he said. She waited. When this is over, he started again. I know you're not coming back. I understand that, and I'm not asking you to. But I want you to know that I understand now what I didn't understand before. Not as an apology, just as a fact. He held the screen's eye without looking away. You were the most capable person in every room we were ever in together. I spent 10 years making sure you felt like you weren't. She looked at him. I know, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was just the truth, received accurately, which was more than she'd expected and enough. "Go talk to Paul," she said. "Then go to Chen." The feed ended. Alara sat in the front room of the Lisbon house in the mid-morning light and felt the shape of the next 12 hours settle around her like weather. Marsh was moving. Geneva was sealed. Whitman had Adrian. Chen was the next variable. And somewhere in the financial district, Victor Halden was about to discover that the intelligence channel he'd built over 2 years had been identified, and the contractor he'd placed in the field had been flagged, and the board play he'd spent months constructing was about to have its financial foundation publicly contradicted by the one man who'd built it. She thought about what Victor would do with that. She thought about a man who had no loyalty, no grief, nothing personal at stake. A man who had been, for years, the fastest person in any room, the one who moved before others knew the board had shifted. She thought about what a man like that does when he realizes he's losing. He doesn't accept it. Her phone rang. Dre. She picked up. "Farr," Dre said. His voice was tight. "Gideon Farr. We located him." "Where?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "He's not in Geneva," Dre said. "He never was. The Geneva positioning was a secondary decoy. Victor sent him there to create noise around the filing, but his actual assignment—" Dre stopped. "Dre." "He's in Lisbon," Dre said. "He's been in Lisbon for 4 days. His hotel is 6 blocks from this house." Alara stood up. She stood in the front room of the safe house with 6 Rourke security personnel on a perimeter that a professional intelligence contractor had apparently been surveilling for 4 days, and she understood that Victor Halden had not sent Gideon Farr to Geneva as a primary play. He had sent Farr to find her, not to watch, not to report. The sound of the perimeter alarm reached her half a second before Cassian appeared at the top of the basement stairs. And in his face, finally, for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that was not containment and not calculation, but the raw animal recognition of a situation that has just become something else entirely. "They're at the wall," he said. The perimeter alarm was not loud. It was a low, sustained tone that moved through the house like a frequency rather than a sound, felt in the sternum before it was heard by the ear. And in the 3 seconds between the alarm activating and Cassian reaching the ground floor, the 6 men on the perimeter had already shifted from their rotation positions into a defensive configuration that Alara could see on the monitor bank Dre had activated on the hallway wall. 4 cameras, 4 angles. The stone wall on the north face had 2 men on it who had not been there 60 seconds ago. "How many?" Cassian said. He was already moving to the equipment cabinet beside the monitor bank, pulling it open, his movements precise and entirely without hurry in the way that trained people move when the situation is serious enough that hurry would be a liability. "North wall, 2 confirmed. Southgate, I'm reading heat signatures, 3, possibly 4. Dre's voice came from the basement stairs where he'd positioned himself with a laptop. "They're not moving yet. They're holding at the perimeter." "Farr doesn't breach immediately," Cassian said. He pulled a phone from the cabinet and handed it to Alara. "Encrypted. Keep it on you." He looked at her steadily. "This is a containment play, not an extraction. He wants to establish position and wait for instruction from Victor." "Victor is in New York," Alara said. "Victor has a phone." Cassian checked the screen on the second monitor. "Farr's job right now is to make sure you can't leave, not to come in." "Yet," Petra said. She had come up from the basement with a tablet and a face that had shed its analytical composure for something more immediate. "If Victor gives the order, Victor is not going to give that order," Alara said. Both of them looked at her. She was already dialing Adrian's number on the encrypted phone. It rang once. He picked up. In the background, she could hear a different quality of noise, voices, movement, the sound of a room that was not calm. "Where are you?" she said. "Paul's office." His voice was tight and strange. "Alara, he's not here. His assistant says he left 40 minutes ago. He took his personal files." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "He ran." "He ran," Adrian confirmed, "which means Victor knows the channel is burned. Which means Victor gave Farr an instruction update in the last 40 minutes. She opened her eyes and looked at Cassian. "They're not holding position to contain me." She turned to face the monitor bank. "They're holding position until Victor tells them whether to come in or pull out. He's deciding right now." "What makes him pull out?" Cassian said, having nothing left to gain. She looked at the phone in her hand. If the board play is dead before Farr does anything here, there's no strategic value in escalating to a physical confrontation with a Rourke security perimeter. Farr is expensive and professional. He doesn't take that risk for a client who's already lost the primary objective. So we kill the board play, Cassian said. In the next 10 minutes, she said, before Victor makes the call. She looked at Adrian through the phone, not a video call, just audio, but she could feel the shape of him on the other end, the specific tension of a man who was standing in a room where something had just gone wrong and was waiting for the next instruction. Chen, she said, did you go to Chen? I'm on my way there now. Whitman is driving. How long? 12 minutes. She looked at the monitors. The men on the north wall had not moved. The heat signatures at the south gate were static. Farr was professional enough to hold until he heard. I need something from you first, she said to Adrian. Before Chen, I need you to call Hargrove. Hargrove is Victor's. Hargrove is a man who has been leveraged into a position he didn't fully choose, she said. There's a difference. Victor has exposure on Hargrove, something Hargrove did that Victor has held over him. I don't know what it is, but the dynamic is leverage, not loyalty. She kept her voice steady, which means if Hargrove understands that Victor's position is collapsing, the leverage loses its power. He becomes a free agent. And a free agent on the board votes his own interest. His own interest is not going down with Victor Halden's ship. She paused. Call him. Tell him you know about the Thursday session. Tell him you're asking him to postpone the vote pending an independent financial audit. Don't threaten. Just ask, directly, as the founder of the company. She paused. He built his career partly on Veilhart Capital's performance. He knows what the company is. Remind him. A silence. She heard the car moving in the background, the sound of city traffic. And if he says no, Adrian said, then we go to Chen, and Chen is enough. She held the phone. But I don't think he says no. I think Hargrove has been waiting for someone to give him a reason to step back from this without losing face. Be that reason. She heard him breathe. All right, he said. Call me when it's done. She held the encrypted phone against her chest and looked at the monitor bank. North wall, still. Southgate, still. Somewhere in a midtown Manhattan office, Gideon Farr was sitting with his own phone, waiting for a call from a man who was about to find out that his board play had just had its first support pulled from beneath it. She thought about Victor in that moment, sitting in his glass and stone apartment or in his office, watching the pieces move on a board he'd spent years constructing, feeling the specific sensation she'd described to Cassian on the plane, the discomfort of being 2 moves behind someone you'd already written off. She thought about what that felt like for a man like Victor. She thought, he's going to do something impulsive. Cassian, she said. He was beside her immediately. When Victor realizes the board play is compromised, his next move is not retreat, she said quietly. He's going to try to destroy the documentation before it can be used in a legal proceeding. The subsidiary accounts, the Stratham contract, the Reeve payments. He's going to try to make everything disappear. She looked at him. How fast can you get that material into a protected legal filing? Petra, Cassian said, without looking away from Alara. 20 minutes if the receiving attorney is already standing by, Petra said from across the room. Get the attorney standing by, Cassian said. Petra was already on her phone. Alara watched the monitors. The north wall was still. The south gate was still. The house around her was the particular quiet of people holding very still inside a situation that had not yet decided which direction it was going to break. Her phone rang. Adrian. Hargrove, Adrian said. His voice was different. Something in it had shifted, loosened slightly, the way a voice shifts when something has gone better than expected. He said yes. She exhaled. He said yes immediately, Adrian continued. He didn't argue, didn't negotiate. He said he'd been uncomfortable with the timeline from the beginning and that an independent audit was the appropriate step. A pause. He sounded relieved. He was relieved, she said. He's been sitting inside Victor's leverage for months. It wears on people. He also said something else. Adrian's voice shifted. He said Paul Deegan called him this morning, before I did. Told him the Thursday session was critical, that any delay would compromise the restructuring window. A pause. He said Paul seemed nervous. Paul knew the Deegan channel was burned, she said. He was trying to accelerate before the board could be pulled back. She processed this. Which means Victor knew before Paul ran. Victor told him to make the call before going dark. Victor was already managing the collapse. Yes. She looked at the monitors. Go to Chen. Even with Hargrove, I want Chen secured. An audit request carries more weight with board consensus. On my way, he said. She ended the call. She looked at Cassian. The documentation. How are we doing? Attorney has the filing framework, Petra said from across the room. We're transferring now, 14 minutes. On the north wall monitor, one of the two figures moved, then stopped. Then both of them stepped back from the wall. Alara watched the screen. The heat signatures at the south gate were shifting, not toward the house, but laterally, the movement of people repositioning to leave rather than to advance. They're pulling back, Dre said from the basement stairs. His voice carried the particular quality of relief that tries not to sound like relief and doesn't entirely succeed. Cassian was watching the monitor with his arms crossed. Farr got the call. Victor told him to stand down, Alara said. Victor is cutting his losses. She watched the figures on the north wall camera complete their retreat and disappear from the frame. She watched the south gate signatures disperse, 4 of them, she could see now, moving in 2 pairs in opposite directions down the hillside with the disciplined separation of professionals who were done with their assignment and were now simply men walking away from a wall in the morning light. The perimeter alarm tone faded. The house was quiet. Alara stood in the hallway of a safe house in Lisbon with an encrypted phone in her hand and her notebook in her other hand, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Then she sat down on the single chair near the door, which she hadn't allowed herself to do in the last hour, and she felt the full weight of the last 18 hours settle into her legs and her shoulders and the back of her neck. Petra, she said, the filing. 11 minutes. Good. Victor Halden called his attorney at 10:47 in the morning, New York time, and instructed him to begin the process of withdrawing the restructuring proposal from the board's agenda. The attorney, who had been preparing the Thursday documents for 6 weeks, asked for a reason. Victor said, "Change circumstances." He ended the call. He sat in his office, not the apartment, but the glass-walled corner office in the Halden Group's building, the one with the view he'd spent 20 years earning. And he looked at the city below and ran the final calculation one more time, the way he always did, the way he'd been trained to do by a life that had rewarded calculation above everything else. The documentation was going into a protected legal filing. He knew that because his contact inside the Geneva oversight body had sent him a flag 20 minutes ago, an amendment to the Rourke filing that effectively sealed the 2018 bridge records behind a jurisdictional wall. He couldn't reach without a legal process that would take months and generate the kind of attention he couldn't afford. The Deegan channel was burned. Paul was gone, which meant Paul was a liability now. A man who knew too much and was frightened enough to become unpredictable. Hargrove had postponed the board session. Daniel Marsh had not come into the office this morning. Victor sat with all of this, and he was not panicking and he was not despairing. He was calculating, the way he always calculated. What could be saved? What had to be sacrificed? What could be restructured in the aftermath? I was still doing this calculation when 2 federal investigators walked into his office at 11:12 in the morning, accompanied by a building security manager who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, and presented him with a document that had been filed 47 minutes earlier with a federal court under seal. The filing included 3 years of documentation on the Holden Partnership subsidiary. It included the Stratham advisory contract. It included the transfer records connecting Sasha Reeve to a Cayman blind trust that traced, through 2 layers, to a Halden Group holding. It included a witness statement from Daniel Marsh dated that morning, attesting to his direct role in executing the financial redirects under Victor Halden's explicit instruction. Victor read the document. He read it the way he read everything, linearly, precisely, without expression. Then he set it on the desk and looked at the federal investigators and said, "I'll need my attorney present." "Of course," said the investigator. It was the last sentence Victor Halden spoke without counsel for the next 14 months. Alara learned about the federal filing from Dre, who had a contact in the court clerk's office who sent a notification when sealed filings of a certain financial category were received. She read the confirmation on Dre's tablet in the basement of the Lisbon house at 11:23 in the morning, and she sat with it for a moment before she said anything. Marsh moved faster than I expected, she said. He filed the statement at 9:58, Dre said, before you'd even finished the call with Adrian about Hargrove. She thought about that. A man sitting in a corner office in Midtown, his son's custody case in one hand and 20 years of career in the other, making a calculation that was, in the end, not complicated. It just required him to be more afraid of the right thing than the wrong one. He made a good choice, she said. He made a self-interested choice, Petra said from across the room. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Ilara said. She stood up. She went upstairs. She went to the window in the front room that looked out at the hillside and the river below, and she stood there for a long time doing nothing in particular. Cassian found her there 15 minutes later. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, which was not hesitation. Cassian did not hesitate, but a kind of consideration, the deliberate pause of a man who understood that the next conversation mattered and wanted to enter it correctly. It's done, he said. I know. Victor will negotiate a plea. His attorneys will try to minimize exposure, but the Marsh statement combined with the financial documentation is sufficient for the primary charges. The Reeve obstruction adds federal weight. He paused. It won't be fast, but it will be complete. And Paul Deegan, she said, he surfaced in Montreal this morning, tried to access a bank account that had been flagged. He paused. He's been detained. Adrian's instructed his legal team to cooperate with the federal investigation. She looked at the river, wide and silver and unhurried in the midday light. How long had Paul been working with Victor, she asked. It was not a question she needed for strategy. It was a question she needed for herself. Our best estimate is 3 years, Cassian said. Victor approached him after the SEC investigation closed, when he identified Paul as the person who had the most complete picture of Veilhart Capital's vulnerabilities. He paused. He offered Paul a share of the company's post-restructuring value, significant enough that Paul decided the relationship he'd built with you and Adrian was worth less than what he was being offered. She absorbed this. 3 years. She had brought Paul into her confidence 2 years ago, which meant for one of those 2 years, everything she'd told him had gone directly to Victor. He told Victor about me before I told him about the Rourke connection, she said. It wasn't a question. Most likely, yes. Victor knew I was Tomas Voss's daughter before I ever sat down with Paul. That's our working assumption. She stood with this. The full dimension of it. Victor had known from the beginning, had known who she was, had known what she represented, had spent 2 years not moving against her directly because moving against a Rourke-adjacent asset carried its own risks, and instead had moved around her, through Adrian, through Paul, using the people she trusted as instruments. He had been careful. She had to grant him that. In a different situation, against a less careful opponent, it might have worked. My father would have handled this differently, she said. Your father would have handled this loudly, Cassian said, and several people would have been hurt in ways that couldn't be undone. He held her gaze. What you did hurt the people who deserved it and protected the people who didn't. That's not a small thing. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the particular quality of presence he always had, contained and genuine, and she had come to understand over the last 2 days, carrying something of his own that was old and complicated and had to do with her father and with the years he'd spent keeping a promise Tomas Voss had extracted from him in some room she'd never seen. Why did you come personally? She asked. To the airfield. You could have sent a representative. The formal reclamation didn't require you to be there. He looked at her for a moment. Your father asked me to, he said. Not recently. Years ago, before he died, before I understood what the request would require. He paused. He said, when the time comes, go yourself. Don't send someone. She'll need to see that it matters enough that you came. He held her gaze. He knew you. He knew you wouldn't trust a proxy. He knew you'd need to see the real thing standing in front of you before you'd believe it was real. She felt something move in her chest at that, old and warm and aching, the way things feel when they arrive too late to be what they could have been and still mean something. He sounds like he knew me better than I knew myself at the time, she said. He talked about you constantly, Cassian said, for years. The daughter he'd hidden, the daughter who was safe somewhere, the daughter who was, his words, the sharpest person he'd ever met, and he included himself in that comparison. A pause. He was not a man who paid that kind of compliment lightly. She pressed her lips together for a moment. She looked back at the river. I never got to be angry at him, she said, for hiding me, for the choice he made. She paused. I understand why he made it. I understand it was the right call given what he knew. But there's a version of my life that went differently, and I never got to be angry at the person who decided that version wasn't the one I'd get. I know, Cassian said. Are you going to tell me he did what he thought was best? No, he said. He did what he could live with, which is different. And you're allowed to be angry about the cost of that. He was quiet for a moment. You can be angry at a dead man and still take what he left to you. Those things aren't contradictory. She looked at him. You've thought about this before, she said. I've had a long time to think about it. He said it simply, without opening the door into whatever was behind it. The position at the organization, running the legitimate global expansion, it's real and it's yours, and it doesn't require you to carry the parts of the legacy you don't want. He paused. Your father built things in shadow because shadow was what was available to him. You'd be building in the light. The methods are different. The responsibility isn't, she said. No, the responsibility isn't. She thought about what that meant. The full weight of it. A seat at a table she'd been kept from for 19 years, offered to her now not as a birthright claimed automatically, but as a choice made with full knowledge of the cost and the shape of the work. She had spent 10 years being invisible. She had spent 3 years building a case in secret. She had spent the last 48 hours fighting a battle on 4 simultaneous fronts across 2 continents. She was 32 years old, and she was tired in a way that went to the bone. And underneath the tiredness was something else. The beginning of something she didn't have a clean word for yet, but that felt like ground, like the first solid thing under her feet in a very long time. I'll need an office, she said. Cassian looked at her. Something moved across his face, not the almost smile she'd seen before, but the real thing, brief and unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. I'll have one ready, he said. He left the doorway. She stood at the window for another few minutes. Then she picked up her phone, her regular phone, not the encrypted one, and she called Adrian. He picked up on the first ring. Chen voted to request the independent audit, he said, before she could speak. His voice was different from any version of it she'd heard in the last 24 hours. Quieter. Stripped down to something that might, in better light, resemble honesty. Hargrove seconded. The Thursday session is formally postponed pending the audit committee's report. A pause. And I just got the notification about the federal filing. I know, she said. You knew before I did. I knew approximately simultaneously. A sound that might, in other circumstances, have been a short laugh. Elara, I want to tell you something, and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond. She waited. The company, the parts of it that your family's financing helped build, the Meridian acquisition, the foundation that everything else was built on, I want to make that right, formally. There are legal structures for acknowledging silent investment. I've already asked the new legal team to look at it. He paused. Not because it fixes anything, but because the record should be accurate. You don't owe me equity in your company, Adrian. I know I don't owe it. I want the record to be accurate. A pause. Those are different things. She thought about it, about what it meant to have a record be accurate, about the 10 years of invisible work that had no record at all, no acknowledgement, no trace, and whether a legal document now could speak to that retroactively in any way that mattered. Talk to the attorneys, she said. If the structure is clean and legal and doesn't create complications for the Rourke organization's position, I won't object. That's not a yes. It's not a no either. She looked out at the river. It's do the work and show me what it looks like. Okay, he said. That's fair? A pause. Are you safe? Yes? The people at the wall, gone. Victor pulled them back. Because he was already dealing with the federal situation. Yes. A long pause. In it she heard him assembling something. The same thing she was assembling, the full shape of everything that had happened in the last 36 hours, the accounting of it, the cost on each side. I told Victor's name to the investigators this morning, Adrian said. Before the federal filing came in, I gave them the documentation from the drive, what was left of it that Paul hadn't compromised, and I told them everything I knew. He paused. I thought it would feel like winning something. It felt like cleaning up a mess I helped make. It was both, she said. That's how it usually works. Yeah. His voice was quiet. Yeah, I think you've known that longer than I have. She said nothing. Alara, he said, I hope, whatever comes next for you, I hope it's what you deserve. A pause. I think you deserve a great deal. She stood at the window with the phone against her ear and the river below her catching the midday light, and she felt the sentence land in the specific way that true things land when they arrive from the right direction, which is not with comfort exactly, but with the clean relief of accuracy. Take care of the company, she said. It's a good company. Don't let the next 10 years be the same as the last 10. I won't, he said. She believed him. Not entirely, not without reservation. She was not a person who extended belief without reservation anymore, if she ever had been. But enough. Enough to mean something. Goodbye, Adrian, she said. Goodbye, he said. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a while longer, not doing anything in particular, not calculating anything, not planning the next move. Just standing in the light with the river below and the quiet house around her, letting the 48 hours settle into something she could carry without it spilling. Then she went upstairs and she slept for 4 hours, deeply, without dreaming, which was the first time she had slept that way in longer than she could accurately remember. 3 weeks later, Alara Voss flew back to New York. Not on the Gulf Stream. On a commercial flight, business class, with a carry-on bag and the dark blue notebook and a document case containing the preliminary charter for the Rourke Organization's legitimate global expansion division, which she had spent 15 days reviewing, annotating, and in several places rewriting from the ground up. She took a car from the airport to a building in Midtown that housed, on its 14th floor, the new offices of what would become, over the next 3 years, through work that was difficult and detailed and sometimes tedious and always real, one of the more consequential financial restructuring operations in the legitimate private sector. The office cash-in had prepared for her was smaller than she'd expected. She appreciated that. Large offices were for people who needed the room to remind them of their own importance. She had never needed that reminder. She had spent too long being invisible to mistake square footage for significance. There was a desk, a window, a chair that was not particularly comfortable, which she would eventually replace with one that was. On the desk was a single item, a small framed photograph placed there by someone who had known to put it there, of a man she had never met as an adult, but whose face she recognized from the few photographs she'd been allowed to keep. Her father, Thomas Voss, standing in a garden somewhere European, squinting slightly into afternoon sun, looking like a man who was trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. She picked it up and looked at it for a moment. She set it back down. She was still angry at him. That was still true. She expected it would remain true for some time, and she had made her peace with the fact that peace and anger could coexist in the same chest without one canceling the other out. She sat down at the desk. She opened the document case. She picked up a pen. She began to work. 3 months after that, on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, she was in a conference room on the 14th floor when her assistant, a young woman named Risa, who was meticulous and unbothered and had, in 3 months, demonstrated a precision that Alara recognized and respected, knocked on the glass and told her there was someone in the lobby. Adrian Veilhart, Risa said. He doesn't have an appointment. He says he won't stay long. Alara looked at the conference room table, at the documents spread across it, the work of an ordinary afternoon, the accumulation of a new life in its early, unglamorous stages. Send him up, she said. He came in looking like himself. The good suit, the controlled bearing, the face of a man who had spent years learning to appear more certain than he was. He also looked like a man who had been through something and had not fully emerged from the other side of it yet, which was accurate, and which she found, unexpectedly, made him easier to look at than the version of him that had known everything and questioned nothing. He stopped in the doorway of the conference room. I heard you were back, he said. I've been back for 3 months. I know. A pause. I didn't want to come before I had something worth saying. She looked at him. And now you do? He came in and sat down across the table from her, without being invited and without apology, which was at least consistent. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her. The independent audit finished 2 weeks ago, he said. Victor's federal case goes to pretrial in the fall. The board has been restructured. Hargrove resigned. Chen is interim chair. 2 new members come in next quarter. He paused. Paul Deegan entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. He'll lose his license. A beat. I thought you should know that directly, not through a filing. Thank you, she said. The company is... He stopped. The company is intact. That's the right word. Not thriving, not perfectly stable, but intact. The audit clarified the damage Victor did, and we're unwinding it. He held her gaze. We kept all 300 employees from the Meridian acquisition. She looked at him. I thought you'd want to know that specifically, he said, given that the financing that made that acquisition possible. I know why you're telling me, she said. He nodded once. She looked at him across the table in the afternoon light of the office she was building, and she saw the full shape of him clearly. The man who had been arrogant and blind and had let himself be shaped by worse people than himself because it was easier than the alternative, and who was now sitting across from her with nothing to perform and nowhere to hide, and was, in that vulnerability, more genuinely himself than she had seen him in years. She thought about 10 years. She thought about all the rooms she had been invisible in, all the problems she had solved without credit, all the small daily decisions to stay and keep building something that he hadn't recognized as being built. She thought about the fact that she did not regret it. Not the staying, not the work, not even the invisibility in its time, because it had made her, had built in her a precision and a patience and a knowledge of her own capacity that she would not have discovered any other way. She thought about her father in the garden, squinting into the sun. The record amendment, she said. The silent investment acknowledgement your attorneys drafted. It's ready when you are, he said. I reviewed it, she said. It's structured correctly. She paused. I'll sign it. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the specific release of tension that had been held so long it had become invisible until it let go. I'm also making a request, she said. He waited. The Meridian employees, the 300. I want a formal review of their compensation structure completed by end of year, not as part of any settlement or acknowledgement, independently, as a company decision. She held his gaze. Those jobs were protected because of work that cost something. The people doing them should be paid appropriately for what they do. Done, he said, without hesitation. She nodded. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the conference room, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the city doing its ordinary business 14 floors below, and there was nothing left that needed to be said. No resolution that hadn't been reached, no debt that hadn't been named, no conversation that had been avoided and now couldn't be avoided any longer. Everything had been said. Everything had been accounted for. She stood up. He stood up. At the door of the conference room, she stopped and turned back. Adrian. He looked at her. You built something real, she said. Whatever else is true, the company, the people in it, the thing you started when you had nothing, that's real. Don't let the last 10 years make you forget that you were capable of it. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly. He didn't say thank you, which was the right call. Thank you would have been insufficient, and he knew it. Take care of yourself, he said instead. I intend to, she said. She went back to her desk. She heard the elevator close behind him. She sat down and looked at the window and the city beyond it, ordinary and indifferent and full of the particular noise of people moving through their days with no knowledge of what had happened in the months preceding this afternoon and no reason to care. She picked up her pen. She looked at the photograph of her father on the desk. She was still angry at him. She was also, she realized, sitting in an office she had earned, in a life that was genuinely and completely her own, with work in front of her that was difficult and real and worth doing, something else as well. She was grateful. Not for the hiding, not for the years of invisibility, or the cost of the silence, or the 10 years in a life that had been too small for what she was. Not for any of that, for the precision, for the patience, for the knowledge, which she had now and would not give back, that she was capable of carrying the full weight of a thing alone in the dark and bringing it intact into the light. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed time. The time was over now. She bent her head over the document in front of her, and she began, in her careful and compressed and entirely her own handwriting, to write the first sentence of what came next. Outside, the city moved on.